Good day. In recent programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, we have discussed growing signs of disarray in the US position in the Middle East and of a disorderly retreat from there. We've seen this to be the case in Afghanistan, where the United States appears to be engaged in what is increasingly looking like a disorderly and chaotic withdrawal. And we've also seen this to be the case in the complete failure of the United States to come up with a coherent response to the events in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Gaza and in the West Bank, where we have seen an escalation of violence over the last few days. One country, one absolutely pivotal country, a key American ally, is noticing this and is taking increasing steps to respond to these indications of US retreat. That country is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, led by the erratic and extraordinary personality of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, we have seen in recent weeks certain moves the Saudis have been taking to mend their fences with Syria and with the government of President Bashar al-Assad. There are apparently quiet negotiations underway, brokered by the Russians, between the Saudis and the Syrians, for Saudi Arabia to reopen its embassy in Damascus and to greenlight Syria's re-entry into the Arab League. I understand that all of this is happening in conjunction with Saudi efforts to re-establish their influence in Lebanon as a counter to Hezbollah there. The Saudis are apparently looking to do this in cooperation with the Syrians, who have in the past shown a desire to maintain influence in Lebanon, distinct from that of Iran and its Hezbollah allies. The Saudis apparently want to align themselves with the Syrians in that effort. Regardless of Saudi intentions, the fact remains that we are now gradually moving away from a situation where the Saudis and their allies in the Middle East have been President Assad's implacable enemies, seeking to overthrow him and destroy his regime, to a situation where they're becoming, if not exactly his friends or allies, at least his partners, and a country which now recognizes that President Assad and his regime in Syria are there to stay. As I've discussed in previous programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, should all these discussions which are underway between the Syrians and the Saudis lead to a successful resolution, that will be a death blow for American policy in Syria. At that point, the continuing efforts of the United States to destabilize the Assad government by clinging on to its base, the US base at Al-Tanf on the Jordanian border, and in that strip of northeast Syria, which the United States, through its Kurdish allies and through the troops it has there, controls, denying Syria its grain and oil. At that point, all those plans will come to naught, and the presence of those US troops will become increasingly untenable and will at some point have to be withdrawn. It will also be the case that US sanctions on Syria, which have already, as I discussed in a recent program, been undermined and is effectively negated by actions taken by the Russians, that those sanctions will become unsustainable also. It will be, in effect, the end of the Syrian war. But great though these developments are in their importance with respect to Syria, they are potentially overshadowed by negotiations which the Saudis have initiated with another important Middle East country, one far more powerful than Syria itself, that's Syria's ally Iran. These negotiations between the Iranians and the Saudis have been underway for several weeks now, and they're taking place in Iraq, where they have been brokered by the Iraqi government. They're apparently proving difficult, which is unsurprising given the long-standing hostility between these two countries, but they are still underway, and the evidence is that they're edging towards some kind of compromise. Now, that compromise will not involve a general settlement of all the issues between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but they will be a massive step in that direction. And they follow from the disastrous war that Saudi Arabia launched against Yemen and against the Houthi fighters who Iran backs there. The Houthis, who undoubtedly get support from Iran, have recently been increasing their strikes, their missile strikes on Saudi oil facilities and other facilities within Saudi Arabia itself, and they have gradually been reducing the effectiveness of the Saudi-backed Yemen government in Yemen itself. Other countries that formed the Saudi coalition that intervened in Yemen, such as the United Arab Emirates, have basically pulled out of that war, and the United States, under the Biden administration, has recently confirmed that it is no longer supplying or providing Saudi Arabia with support there. So the Saudis, finding themselves in a very difficult situation in Yemen, facing the potential risk of the war in Yemen spilling over into their own territory, facing missile and rocket attacks by the Houthis on Saudi facilities, and perhaps even worrying about the potential for a Houthi offensive into Saudi Arabia itself, have decided to talk to Iran. And the deal that is apparently being discussed between the Saudis and the Iranians is along these lines, that the Iranians restrain their Houthi allies from launching further attacks on Saudi territory and dissuade the Houthis from launching rocket and missile and drone strikes on Saudi oil facilities in return for Saudi Arabia facilitating sales of Iranian oil. Now, if that happens, the sanctions that the United States has imposed on Iran, which are aimed at choking the Iranian economy by blocking its oil exports, will in effect collapse. It's inconceivable that the United States would want to extend its sanctions to Saudi Arabia. Doing that would massively disrupt the oil trade at a time when oil prices are already rising. And it would mean that Iran was able to sell its oil, or at least some of its oil, in effect circumventing US sanctions and bringing those sanctions effectively to naught. Now, as I said, these negotiations are proving apparently very tricky. It's debatable how far the two countries trust each other. The Saudis have made it very clear that they don't trust the Iranians at all, and we shall see whether those negotiations achieve a positive outcome. My guess is that eventually they will. After all, what alternative do the Saudis have but to negotiate with the Iranians at this time? The other point to understand about these negotiations is that they're taking place again within that general framework that I discussed at the start of this video, the framework of a general US retreat from the Middle East. The Saudis, like other countries, are starting to sense that that American shield behind which they have lived and worked and conducted their foreign policy up to now is becoming increasingly brittle and uncertain. They no longer have that backing in Yemen that they had before. They've seen American policy in Syria lead nowhere. They've seen the United States retreat from Afghanistan. Above all, they see that the United States is itself negotiating with Iran and is edging towards rejoining the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which puts temporary restrictions on the Iranian nuclear enrichment program. The Saudis obviously realize that if those negotiations between Iran and the United States to reactivate the JCPOA are successful, then Iran is likely to get some sanctions relief, which, taken together with Iran's recent economic deal, giant economic deal with China, and its increasing engagement with Russia, and its likelihood of obtaining effective military supplies from Russia, will put Iran in an exceptionally strong position vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, which has been Iran's major regional rival. So the Saudis, looking at all of this, looking at all of these steps taken by the United States, have unsurprisingly concluded that they have no option but to talk to the Iranians and to see whether they can come to some kind of modus vivendi with them. I'm going to say something further about this. If these negotiations succeed, if the Saudis do reach some sort of modus vivendi with Iran, then it has massive implications both for the United States and for its other key regional ally, Israel, which is also, I think, starting to sense that US support for Israel is beginning to falter. I did a recent program in which I discussed the waffly nature of US readouts and statements by US officials with respect to the ongoing crisis in Israel at the moment. And one of the most interesting and fascinating things about those readouts, which I'm going to discuss now briefly, is that there was not a word of condemnation in them for Hamas or the Palestinians or the people who were launching the rockets against Israel, such as one might have expected in previous times. Now, I'm not going to go into details about this. I'm only going to say that previous administrations would certainly have been far more full-throated in their support for Israel than the current administration in Washington is. In fact, one gets the impression of an administration which is not only lacking in vision and ideas and lacking in interest, but which doesn't like its allies in the Middle East very much. It doesn't like Saudi Arabia, where the administration began its term by criticizing, by labeling Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as the person responsible for the murder of the dissident Saudi journalist Khashoggi. And frankly, I get the sense that some people in this administration don't like Israel very much, or at least they don't like Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite all the flowery words of support for Israel, which we have seen coming. Now, if Saudi Arabia is able to draw these conclusions and is going to start cutting deals with regional rivals like Syria and Iran, And ultimately, I expect with China and Russia, which are increasingly maneuvering to fill the vacuum that is going to be left in the Middle East if the United States retreats, then I predict that Israel is going to find itself obliged to do the same. After all, what alternative do the Israelis also have? The European Union is a broken reed, and whilst China and Russia are obviously not an alternative or a substitute for the United States, at least they have made clear in recent years that they're not hostile to Israel and do not challenge its rights to exist, as sporadically some Arab forces and even some Iranian spokesmen have come close to doing or have actually done. So, at that point, what we could very well start to see is not just an American retreat from the Middle East, but an American collapse of America's entire position in the Middle East. To be very clear, that would be an extraordinary change. The United States, faced with Soviet penetration of the Middle East in the 1960s, made a massive effort starting from the 1970s to marginalize the Soviet Union and to establish itself as the dominant power in the Middle East. In doing so, it was completely successful. It has dominated the Middle East ever since, forging close alliances with the major Middle East powers, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and also taking steps to isolate countries like Iran, Iraq, and Syria, which at various times looked like they might be hostile or potential challengers to its own predominant position there. That was an extraordinarily successful policy for many decades. It's remarkable how quickly and how indifferently it's all being allowed to fall apart. I wonder how much real understanding there is of all of this in Washington itself. I wonder how much various US officials and US think tanks and political groups which have been so committed to US policy in the Middle East, who after all, only a short time ago were talking about creating a new Middle East, to what extent they understand precisely what is going on. I suppose the first indications of this were provided in the final years of the Obama administration, of which in so many respects the Biden-Harris administration is a successor. Obama, as we know, did not get on particularly well. In fact, he didn't get on well at all with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, and he was very wary of the Saudis and made little secret of his disdain for them. And he also embraced the various Arab Spring revolutions that took place in places like Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere, and of course in Syria too. And I think it is generally accepted that the Obama administration did see a decline in American influence in the Middle East, and by the way, also a rise in the power of the various jihadi groups there, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It seems to me that the United States, under the Biden administration, is taking that policy, or that perhaps not even a policy, absence of policy, that indifference to the Middle East that was already evident by Obama, under Obama, to a whole new stage. It's not an orderly and organized retreat from the Middle East, such as might have been carried out by another administration, taking greater account of the importance of maintaining some kind of stability there. It is rather a disorganized retreat born fundamentally of indifference. I wonder how sustainable it will be, and I wonder what the long-term effects of it will be. Anyway, regardless of that, we see how the Saudis, at least, are already taking steps to adjust themselves to that new reality. Thank you for joining me on this program. Thank you also for coming to this channel. Please also look up our other channel, our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. You can also find these channels and also certain special videos that we do on our other platforms, Odyssey, SuperTube, and Locals. And you will find links of all of those channels and of all of those platforms under this video. Please also check out or support us to the extent that you can through Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And we accept, I should say, donations in all currencies, including the new electronic ones. You're not under any obligation, obviously, to make donations. We understand that these are hard times, but we are very grateful to you if you can find your way to making these, since obviously for us to make these programs is not easy for us at this time. And also, please don't forget to check out our Discord server and go to our shop and buy all the wonderful things you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and our famous t-shirts. And thank you for joining me on this program. And I look forward to you joining me again on future programs, both on this channel and on our other ones. And have a wonderful day until then.